Hi everyone! In today's lesson, we are talking about relative clauses, those helpful parts of a sentence that give us extra information. We will also learn how to use relative pronouns like who, whom, which, whose, and that. You'll understand the difference between defining clauses, which give essential information, and non-defining clauses, which just add extra details. By the end of this video, you will know how to connect ideas clearly and sound more natural in English. So if you're ready, let's get started. What is a relative clause? A relative clause gives extra information about a noun, which is a person or thing, in the main clause. It begins with a relative pronoun and connects two ideas into one sentence. So now you may ask me, what is the main clause? Then, what is a relative pronoun? How do I know all these terms? Now we will learn everything step by step. Let's take a look at this sentence. The woman who is talking to the teacher is my mother. So the woman is my mother. This is the main clause. The woman is my mother. This is the main clause. Who is talking to the teacher is the relative clause. Now, a woman is a noun. Who is a relative pronoun. The clause who is talking to the teacher tells us more about the woman. So the relative clause begins with a relative pronoun, as in this example it's who, and connects two ideas, the woman is my mother and who is talking to the teacher, into one sentence. And it gives us extra information about a noun in the main clause. So this is the main clause, the woman is my mother. And this is a noun in the clause, woman. So who is talking to the teacher gives us extra information about this woman. Which woman? Who is talking to the teacher. These are relative pronouns that help us connect the main clause and the relative clause. Who, whom, whose, which, and that. Now, how to tell the difference between a main clause and a relative clause? What's the difference? How do I understand where is the main clause and where is the relative clause? Let's learn. Main clause can stand alone as a complete sentence, has a subject and a verb, expresses a complete thought. Relative clause cannot stand alone, starts with a relative pronoun who, whom, whose, which, or that, and gives extra information about a noun in the main clause. So let's take a look at this example. The man who lives next door is a doctor. So the man is a doctor is the main clause, right? So if you just say, the man is a doctor, does it make sense? Yes. So it can stand alone. Now, who lives next door is a relative clause. Who lives next door? Does it make sense if it stands alone? No, because it depends on the main clause. It gives us extra information about the man, about the noun. And who is a relative pronoun that connects the main clause and the relative clause. So our main clause, the man is a doctor, is a complete sentence. Relative clause, who lives next door? It's not a full sentence. The relative clause tells us more about the man. Let's take a look at this example. I read the book that you recommended. I read the book is the main clause. That you recommended is the relative clause. The book is a noun in the main clause. That is a relative pronoun that connects the main clause and the relative clause. I read a book is the main clause. It's a complete sentence. It can stand alone. A relative clause that you recommended. It's not a full sentence. The relative clause tells us more about the book. What kind of book that you recommended. So now I hope you understand the difference between the main clause and the relative clause. Now let's learn about the relative pronouns. What are relative pronouns? Relative pronouns are words that introduce relative clauses. They connect a noun, a person, thing, or idea in the main part of a sentence to additional information about that noun. For example, the teacher whom we met was very kind. So the teacher was very kind is the main clause. Now, whom we met. Whom is the relative pronoun. It connects a noun, the teacher in this case, to additional information about that noun. What kind of teacher? Whom we met. So whom connects these two clauses. And now let's take a look at the chart that will help you to understand the purpose of each relative pronoun. So we have relative pronouns: who, whom, whose, which, and that. Now we are going to talk about what they refer to, what each pronoun refers to, their function in the clause, and we'll take a look at the example, of course. So who refers to people or pets. So if you're talking about people or pets in the main clause, then you can use who in the relative clause. The function in the clause is the subject. For example, the boy who won the prize is my cousin. So who, in here we are talking about the boy. The boy is a person, so people, right, is the person. So who refers to the boy. We also use whom when we are talking about people, but the function in the clause is the object. For example, the girl whom I invited came late. The girl came late is the main clause. Whom I invited is the relative clause. So whom refers to people, to the person, the girl, and is an object in the relative clause. I know it may look a little bit confusing, but this is just an overview. Soon we are going to dive into the details. Whose refers to people or things. It shows possession. For example, the man whose car broke down is my neighbor. Now, which. We use which when we are talking about animals or things. And the function of which in the sentence can be subject or object. For example, I love the movie which you recommended. What kind of movie which you recommended? So which here we are talking about the thing. The movie is the thing, right? So that's why we use which. And we can use that when we refer to people, things, or animals. And it can function as subject or object. That is more informal than who, whom, or which. The phone that she bought is expensive. That refers to the thing in this example, the phone. The phone that she bought is expensive. So we have a general overview of all of the relative pronouns. And now let's talk about each relative pronoun step by step. So first of all, you may ask me, what's the difference between who and whom if they both refer to people, right? So who is the subject of the relative clause. It does the action in the clause. If the person is doing something, use who. Whom is the object of the relative clause. It receives the action in the clause. If something is done to the person, use whom. So one more time. If the person is doing something, use who. But if something is done to the person, use whom. This is the difference. For example, the boy who won the race is my cousin. So who is the subject in this sentence? Won is the verb. The race is an object. So in this example, who does the action because it refers to the boy. We can say the boy won the race. Who means the boy. That's why who is the subject. Who does the action? Who won the race? I saw a woman who was dancing in the street. Who is the subject? Was dancing is the verb. In the street is the prepositional phrase. So in this relative clause, again, who does the action? We can say the woman was dancing in the street. So who, the woman, who functions as the subject in this relative clause. Let's take a look at this example. The teacher whom I respect is kind. So here I is the subject, respect is the verb, and whom is an object. I respect whom? I respect the teacher. Whom is an object. It's not the subject. That's why we use whom in this sentence. I respect whom? I respect the teacher. Here, the teacher does not do the action. I respect the teacher. I respect whom? Whom is an object. The woman whom we invited to the party is here. We is the subject. Invited is the verb. Whom is an object. We invited whom? We invited the woman. So whom is an object, right? We invited whom? The woman. So whom is an object. The girl who helped me is my friend. The girl whom I helped is my friend. Let's see the difference. So who is the subject? Helped is the verb. Me is an object. The girl whom I helped is my friend. Whom is an object. I is a subject and helped is the verb. So here is the difference. In the first sentence, the subject who does the action, who helped me. So it means the girl helped me. The girl does the action. And in the second sentence, whom I helped. So I helped the girl. I helped whom? The girl. So here the girl is an object. That's why in the first sentence we should use who and in the second, whom. But again, in everyday speech, whom is often replaced with who, and that's okay in informal contexts. But if you need to use these relative pronouns in formal contexts, or maybe you have a written exam, it's better to use them based on the rules. So in formal, you can say, the woman whom I interviewed was polite. Informal, the woman who I interviewed was polite. And in a very informal context, you can say, the woman I interviewed was polite. You can even drop this pronoun. The woman I interviewed was polite. All right, great job. So we are done with who and whom. Now let's talk about whose. Whose is a relative pronoun used to show possession. It connects a noun, person, animal, or thing to something that belongs to it. Whose acts like a possessive determiner in the relative clause. It replaces his, her, its, their in sentences, and it is followed by a noun. For example, the boy whose phone was stolen is crying. So, the phone is the subject, was stolen is the verb, and whose is the possessive determiner in this sentence. So whose is the relative pronoun that acts like a possessive determiner in the sentence. Whose phone was stolen? Which boy whose phone was stolen? The boy is crying. His phone was stolen. Whose phone? His phone. So you can see that whose can be replaced by his. I found the cat whose tail was injured. Tail is the subject. Was injured is the verb. Whose is the possessive determiner. So here we're talking about the animal, the cat. And again, we can use whose. Which cat whose tail was injured? So the tail belongs to the cat, right? Whose tail was injured. I found the cat its tail was injured. So here, whose tail? Its tail. Whose can be replaced by its if we are using two separate sentences. The house whose roof was damaged needs repair. Roof is the subject, was damaged is the verb, whose is the possessive determiner. The house needs repairs. Its roof was damaged. Whose roof? Its roof. So you can see we can use the relative pronoun whose even when we are talking about the things. We are talking about the house. The house is the thing. And we still can use whose when we show possession. So whose roof? The house's roof, right? The house whose roof was damaged. Great job. We are done with whose. Now let's talk about which. Which is a relative pronoun used to give more information about things, animals, or sometimes entire ideas or sentences. So we use which when we're talking about things, animals, entire ideas, or even sentences. Let's see what I mean. It introduces a relative clause that describes or adds details to a noun, but not a person. So we use which when we want to give more information about things or animals, but not people. It's important to remember. Use which when referring to things, animals, ideas, or whole clauses in non-defining relative clauses. Soon you will know the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Don't worry. So let's take a look at these examples. The book which is on the table is mine. The phone which I bought last year is already broken. So here in the first sentence, the book which is on the table is mine, which is the subject, is the verb, on the table is the prepositional phrase. In the second example, my phone which I bought last year is already broken. I is the subject, bought is the verb, which is an object. So you can see that which can be the subject in a relative clause and the object as well. And now please pay attention that in the first sentence, we do not have commas at the beginning and at the end of the relative clause. But in the second sentence, we do have commas at the beginning and at the end of the relative clause. Why is it happening? Soon I'll answer this question. Just be very attentive, please. It's very important. The dog which barked all night kept me awake. Our car, which we just repaired, broke down again. He failed the test, which surprised everyone. So here, which refers to the fact that he failed, not just the test. So now tell me please, in the first sentence, the dog which barked all night kept me awake, which refers to an animal, right? The dog. Our car, which we just repaired, broke down again. Here, which refers to the car, the thing. Okay, he failed the test, which surprised everyone. And here, which refers to the fact that he failed, not just the test. All right, to the whole idea, to the fact that he failed. And again, if you look at these three sentences, in the first sentence, we do not have commas at the beginning and at the end of the relative clause. In the second sentence, we do have commas, and in the third sentence, again, we have a comma at the beginning, and then at the end we have a period because it's the end of the sentence. Now, let's clarify why is it happening, why in some sentences we do need to use commas, and in others we don't. So for this, you need to know about two types of relative clauses. These are defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. Defining relative clauses give us essential information. Without them, the sentence is not complete or not clear. Do not use commas with defining clauses. For example, the student who studies hard will pass. Let's say the student will pass. It makes sense, but the sentence is not clear. Which student, right? You may say, the student will pass. Which student? Who studies hard. Without this small part, who studies hard, so without this clause, we don't know which student. So the sentence is not clear for us. Okay, so let's remember that defining clauses provide us essential information. And we do not use commas at the beginning and at the end of the clause. You don't need to use commas. Now let's take a look at this example. I need the book that explains grammar. I need the book. Okay, which book do you need? That explains grammar. So without the clause, we don't know which book. The sentence is not clear, right? Okay, non-defining clauses give us extra or non-essential information. The main sentence still makes sense without the clause. For this, you need to use commas. Do not use that. Use only who, which, or whose. So if you want to add some extra information, first of all, you should use commas. When you want to add something extra, you need to kind of separate it with commas. And you cannot use that. You should use only who, which, or whose, depending on your example. For example, my brother, who lives in Japan, is visiting next week. So, my brother is visiting next week. Is it clear? Yes. But here we just want to add something extra. The sentence is still clear without the extra information, but we just want to add more details. Who lives in Japan? So it's up to us. So if we decide to do so, we need to first of all separate this clause by commas and remember that we cannot use that. Only who, which, or whose, depending on the sentence. This laptop, which I bought last year, is very fast. This laptop is very fast. Does it make sense? Yes, it does. But I just want to add something extra, so the sentence is still clear without the extra information. This laptop is very fast. But it's up to me. I want to add more details. If I do so, which I bought last year, I need to remember about commas, and also I need to remember that I cannot use that. I should use only who, which, or whose. In my example, I must use which, because the laptop is the thing. Now you can tell me, okay, so you can't use that in non-relative clauses. When you can use that? Finally, can you tell me when can we use that? First of all, you can use that with people instead of who or whom in defining clauses. Remember that. In defining clauses. For example, you can say, the teacher that helped me was kind. It can be correct. Also, you can say, the teacher who helped me was kind. So here we can use that instead of who. That replaces who or whom when talking about people, but only in defining clauses. Clauses that are necessary to understand the sentence. Okay, please remember this. That's why we need to know the difference between defining and non-defining clauses. Also, you can use that with things or animals instead of which, and again in defining clauses. For example, I lost the book that you gave me. You can use that instead of which. I lost the book which you gave me. You can say, I lost the book which you gave me, and I lost the book that you gave me. The only difference is that you use that in informal situations. That replaces which when talking about things or animals, but only in defining clauses. Clauses that are necessary to understand the sentence. Now, when you cannot use that. In non-defining clauses, so clauses with commas. Incorrect way to say, my sister that lives in Spain is visiting. It's wrong. You should say only, my sister who lives in Spain is visiting. This is the correct way. You must use who, whom, or which, and never that in non-defining clauses when you give extra details. Okay. Also, you cannot use that after prepositions, especially in formal writing. For example, it's wrong to say, the person to that I spoke was helpful. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't sound natural. The correct way to say is, the person to whom I spoke was helpful. Now, when can you omit the relative pronouns? We learned when we can use all of the relative pronouns, but sometimes you can hear that native speakers omit the relative pronouns. So there are certain rules when you can do that. You can omit the relative pronoun like that, which, who, or whom, only when it is the object of the relative clause, not when it's the subject. So omitting relative pronouns when it's the object is possible. The book that I read was exciting. That is the object of read. You can omit that. The book I read was exciting. The movie which we watched was long. Which is the object of watched. You can omit which. The movie we watched was long. Now, if it's the subject, you cannot omit it. You cannot omit the relative pronoun if this is the subject of a sentence, of the clause. For example, the man likes pizza is my friend. It's not correct. You cannot say like that because we are missing the subject of likes, right? And in English language, you cannot have a sentence without the subject. So the correct way to say, the man who likes pizza is my friend. Who is the subject of likes. We cannot omit who in this sentence. You cannot omit whose. All right, so this is the only relative pronoun that you cannot omit. You can't say, I met a girl, brother is a pilot. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Because if you remove whose, the sentence breaks because you lose the link and the possessive meaning. Remember that whose shows possession. If you drop it, you just lose this possessive meaning. The correct way to say is, I met a girl whose brother is a pilot. That's why, remember, you cannot omit whose. You cannot omit any relative pronoun in non-defining relative clauses. If you can omit some of the pronouns in defining relative clauses, you cannot omit any relative pronoun in non-defining relative clauses. Because in non-defining clauses, the relative pronoun is required to maintain the structure of the sentence, whether it's the subject or the object. Even if the pronoun is the object, you must include it in non-defining clauses. Okay? For example, this phone, which costs a lot, is waterproof. You cannot say this phone costs a lot is waterproof. It doesn't even sound natural, right? So please do not omit any relative pronouns in non-defining relative clauses. And in this sentence, which is the subject? Subject must be included. I gave the painting to my aunt, who I admire deeply. Who I admire deeply is a non-defining relative clause. It gives us some extra details. That's why it's wrong to say, I gave the painting to my aunt, I admire deeply. So we cannot omit that. Even if who is the object in this sentence, it must still be included. If the clause has commas, you must keep the relative pronoun. Okay? Please remember that. And one more important thing to understand is the tense usage. Understanding tense usage in main clauses and relative clauses. There is no fixed rule that the main clause and relative clause must have the same tense. The tense in each clause depends on the time of each action. Think of the main clause and the relative clause as two separate ideas, each with its own time. For example, you can use the same tense in both clauses. She knows a man who owns 3 cars. Both clauses are in present simple tense. But also you can see the different tenses in the clauses. For example, she knows a man who lived in Japan for 10 years. So in the first clause, in the main clause, she knows a man, we use the present simple tense. Who lived in Japan for 10 years, we use here past simple tense. Also, you can see that sometimes both clauses can be in past tense. Like in this example, I saw the dog that ran away yesterday. And sometimes you can use even future tense in the main clause. For example, I'll hire someone who understands this technology. So I'll hire someone. We are talking about the future, that I'll do this in the future. Who understands this technology? Here we're talking about general fact. Who understands this technology? That's why the relative clause we use in present simple tense. I actually have a video about 12 English tenses. So if you need more practice or more clarification when to use each tense, please check out this lesson. All right, and now it's time to do the test. Choose the correct relative pronoun. So I would like you to read the sentences. Please pause the video. Overall, we have 15 sentences. Read the sentences, and here you need to use the correct relative pronoun. Please remember that in some of the sentences you can have a few correct answers. So you can use a few pronouns and it's going to be correct. And sometimes you can even omit that pronoun. Anyways, pause the video. Complete this test and we are going to check it in a minute. But make sure to do this test by yourself. These are 8 sentences. Pause the video. Then do this part. Again, pause the video. All right, great job. And now it's time to check your answers. The girl who won the race is my cousin. So in this sentence, we can use only who. The teacher who we met yesterday is very friendly. The teacher that we met yesterday is very friendly. The teacher whom we met yesterday is very friendly. The teacher we met yesterday is very friendly. So these are all the options you can use in the second sentence. Number 3, I saw a car which had a flat tire. I saw a car that had a flat tire. 2 options. That's the man whose son is a famous actor. Number 5. The book which you recommended was excellent. The book that you recommended was excellent. Number 6. He is the artist whose paintings were stolen. Number 7. The woman who I spoke to is a lawyer. The woman that I spoke to is a lawyer. The woman whom I spoke to is a lawyer. The woman I spoke to is a lawyer. So there are 4 options you can use. The dog which barked all night kept me awake. The dog that barked all night kept me awake. The house which Jack built is still standing. The house that Jack built is still standing. Number 10. They hired a manager who everyone respects. They hired a manager whom everyone respects. They hired a manager that everyone respects. They hired a manager everyone respects. Number 11. The email which you sent was unclear. The email that you sent was unclear. Number 12. The girl whose hair is curly is in my class. 13. The person who answers the phone is very polite. 14. The friend who I traveled with moved abroad. The friend that I traveled with moved abroad. The friend whom I traveled with moved abroad. The friend I traveled with moved abroad. And number 15. The shoes that I bought yesterday are too small. The shoes which I bought yesterday are too small. The shoes I bought yesterday are too small. All right, great job. I'm very proud of you. Please let me know in the comments below your score. Did you get 15 out of 15? Or maybe 10 out of 15? Or maybe 12 out of 15? Please let me know your score in the comments below. I'm very excited to see that. Great job! Thank you for learning English with me. If you enjoyed this lesson, please remember to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave your comments below. And of course, I'll see you in my next videos. See you soon. Take care.